Today, we become legends.
Today's Titan Talk was pretty much all about matchmaking, as they had Max aka Innocent Rabbit on the show to discuss all the things they've been doing and will be doing with matchmaking going forward. There were some questions about other aspects of the game, but a lot of this talk was going deep on matchmaking, so let's get started. So first up, they had a brief overview of the changes they've been making to matchmaking over the course of the open beta so far, as well as a few things going forward for OB5 and beyond. In OB1, the matchmaking algorithms were essentially making or not making matches based on match quality, basically a numerical metric of what the system thought the skill levels of each player in the match was. SR or level range, basically the difference between the top and bottom SR player in ranked and top and bottom account level player in casual, as well as party compositions. If one team has a 5-stack and the other team is all solo queue, the match probably won't be made, for example. They also mentioned that they do expand the matchmaking limits as the queue time increases, starting off with a smaller range like 500 SR, then increasing it to 1000 after a certain amount of queue time, continually increasing until a viable match is found. This can lead to some matches that are clearly not ideal, but they feel it's better than having 10-minute plus queue times to find a more ideal match, as based on their data, players leave the queue at a very high rate once it gets to around 10 minutes. In OB2, they added team average SR into the picture, which was already somewhat accounted for in the match quality metric that they use, but this was apparently a better implementation for their needs. They also expanded their backend skill ratings, basically hidden MMR, to be included in the matchmaking system, which was very important for casuals. And finally, for OB2, they also added trio queue specific matchmaking, where, for example, instead of taking the average SR of the party, if you're in a trio queue, it instead takes the highest SR of the party, probably to avoid two very good players pulling in a bad player and still stomping. Open Beta 3, they did various new player improvements in the matchmaking. They didn't go into specifics much here, but general improvements to the new player experience. They did some other QOL stuff like pause duration and the your turn to pick notification, that kind of stuff. And in OB4, they added what they call the final lobby rule adherence, which is basically if one or two players in the queue have been waiting a very long time, it could affect the match quality of completely unrelated matches by expanding their ranges when it didn't need to, so that should have been fixed in OB4. They also did a pass for very high-end ranked players to more often get into games with other very high-end ranked players rather than pulling them into lobbies with players much worse than them. And finally, for the overview section they did at the start, they talked a little bit about their priorities going forward for matchmaking, with the first one being a logical team and matchup balance, which basically means balancing the teams after the match is made. Currently, they just make the match based on the rules and don't really look too much at if it's the best possible makeup of that lobby that they can do. In the future, they plan to do a pass after the match is made to look at various team compositions within those 10 players and make the best one possible. If this is done well, it could be huge in my opinion, and I think a decent portion of matches that felt very unbalanced were because the teams themselves were unbalanced, not necessarily the entire lobby or average SR. They're also exploring more ways to allow top SR players to get into matches with other top SR players more frequently. And they're also looking at more ways to improve the new player experience in the first 10 to 20 matches to get them to stick around more. This will again be huge if done right, as I see all the time that new players come in, enjoy the game against bots, but then once they come out of those bot games, they end up being put against players who know what they're doing and get stomped 5 games in a row and quit. This should help a ton with that if they can get it to work right. And finally, before we get into the Q&A section, they mentioned new competitive formats going forward, which sounds exciting. Maybe an in-game tournament mode to make it easier to run amateur tournaments with integrated brackets, potentially even a spectator UI that allows one spectator to quickly swap between matches and keep an eye on the whole bracket. This is just my speculation, they didn't go into specifics about this, but this kind of stuff could be really cool for amateur competitive Smite in the absence of SPL. They said they should have more details to share on this kind of stuff fairly soon. Moving into Q&A though, the first question was basically asking why not just hard cap SR ranges and make people wait as long as it takes to find a good match. And their response was basically just most players don't want to wait 20 minutes to find a game, even if it means that game is a much better one than they waited 3 minutes for. Some very dedicated players are willing to wait a lot longer, but the vast majority of players just leave the queue if it reaches 5 to 10 minutes, so it services the most people to expand ranges over time and keep the queue times down to a reasonable level. This kind of system might work at peak hours in the middle ranks of a high population server like NA or EU, but if you're on a lower population server outside of peak hours or at the extremities of the ranked ladder, it simply would never make a match without expanding the range. They also said that while there can be outliers in cases like I just mentioned where queue times can get upwards of 10 minutes, the average queue time is actually closer to 2 minutes for ranked, with about 50% of matches in ranked popping before the 2-minute mark, around 90% of matches before 6 6 minutes and 99% of matches before 10 minutes. So if you do get those 10-minute plus queues, it sucks, but you are an outlier in about the 1% of players there. Max also gave some casual numbers for this, with over 90% of casual matches popping before 3.5 minutes and 99% of casual matches popping before 5 minutes. So again, if you're in casual and your queue goes longer than 5 minutes, that's a 1% minority, not the average experience, at least according to the data that Hi-Rez have. They also did mention that it's always a balancing act and a trade-off between queue times, match quality, and player population. If people were willing to wait infinite time, they could always make a great match. If people were willing to have bad quality matches, there will be very little wait time. If the game had infinite player population, you could have great matches and fast queue times. But the reality is that Smite's a fairly niche game, and especially at off-peak hours or low population servers, you have to make the best of what you can in terms of balancing queue times versus match quality. Someone asked about why you can party up with such a wide range of SR, and basically they said they don't have the tech to limit parties based on SR range at the moment. It's either parties on or parties off for ranked. But they tentatively have this tech planned for OB6, so around 2 weeks from now. They're also having discussions internally on what the range limit should be. Should it be different for different SR levels and party sizes, all that kind of stuff. But once again, it's a bit of a balancing act. Having wide ranges for parties can make matches more unbalanced than they need to be, but allowing it does allow more players to come into the ranked experience, as a dedicated ranked grinder can bring in their more casual friends who are basically unranked or very low rank, and maybe turn them into future ranked grinders. They also mentioned that the expanded competitive formats thing that they mentioned earlier could help with this as a way for the really hyper competitive ranked players to get an even more competitive experience out of it rather than just grinding for SR. Someone asked about ranked rewards or making ranked the default mode. For rewards, they basically reiterated what they've said before on this topic, in that rewards have to be carefully thought out so as to not encourage players who don't take ranked seriously to play just for rewards. So it generally can't be stuff like diamonds or anything too valuable. It's best when the reward is something like ranked borders and frames, like the ones we're going to be getting for this season, where it's rewarding for those that do want to grind ranked, but not something that casual players who don't take ranked seriously would even care about. In terms of making ranked the default mode, they basically said there are a lot of people who play Smite casually and don't want the pressure of playing ranked, which I think is perfectly understandable. It would make ranked a worse experience for those that do have that competitive mindset, and would make the general Smite experience worse for casual players as well. Someone asked about how exactly casual matchmaking works, and they basically said it works on account level as well as hidden casual MMR. I believe this is very similar to how Smite 1 handled things. Smite 1 had separate MMR per mode as well. I'm not sure if Smite 2 has that in place yet. They did also mention that once you're past around account level 30, the system doesn't really look at account level anymore. It's only really taken into account at the lower numbers to try and keep new players against other new players. They said that if you're over account level 30 and get a very low level player in your match, it's either the new player was waiting a very long time and couldn't find a viable match with only new players to make, or the new player was queuing in a party with a more experienced player and they pulled him or her into your match. They addressed some of the sort of conspiracy theories around ensuring that you as a player always maintain a 50% win rate, and said that's not how they do matchmaking. They matchmake purely based on the quality of that individual match. They're not taking a player on a win streak and deliberately putting them into a match that they will almost certainly lose to keep them at 50%. That's just not something they do. Someone asked about the profanity filter and all chat in Smite 2, and they basically said they're still looking at potential cases where the filter misinterprets things, but generally they are happy with the chat being more restrictive in Smite 2 than it was in Smite 1 to combat toxicity. Same reasoning for no all chat. In terms of when the next ranked reset will be, they didn't give a specific answer, but basically said that when the alternative competitive formats they're working on are ready to release, that's probably when there will be a reset. No current timeline on that though. Someone asked about switching the ranked conquest requirement to matches of casual conquest played, not account level, which they said does make sense and is probably something they'll do, just to avoid someone playing arena or only against bots until account level 10 and then entering ranked conquest without ever having played a casual conquest before. Someone asked about party averages, and basically in casuals the party will be averaged out completely. In ranked there's a mix of averaging and skewing towards the highest player. For example, in 3-man parties it skews much more heavily towards the highest player, but it won't be exactly the highest player's SR. It still averages a little bit. The role-specific matchmaking was mentioned, and they basically said that Rally here, the backend that Smite 2 runs on, are currently working on the tech to build out MMR profiles for players that can store multiple ratings for each role, so hopefully at some point fairly soon we'll see this. This is another huge feature that, if done right, could make a massive difference, as a match may seem balanced based on average team SR, but if the enemy's best player is a solo main at 5000 SR, and your team's worst player is a mid main at 4000 SR that got filled into solo lane, they will get stomped, and the match will be very unbalanced in practice, even if it seemed balanced on paper. I would estimate, in my own personal experience, that my best role solo is probably around 2 full ranks higher than my worst role in ADC. If I get filled ADC at my current rank, it usually goes badly, and likewise, if I got solo lane at a match 2 ranks below my current rank, I would stomp. So if this system could be done right, it could be absolutely huge for overall match balance, and I'm very excited for this to finally make it into the game. It's probably the biggest matchmaking game changer that's yet to come to Smite 2. Someone asked if it would be possible to have an opt-in system for longer queue times but better match quality, and Max basically said it would probably not work out that well, as not only are you opting into waiting longer, you're also splitting the player base, so those that do opt in can't queue with those that don't opt in, which would push queue times even higher and will probably result in 30-minute plus wait times or even longer. Someone asked if matchmaking could be more transparent by, for example, giving players a pop-up saying matchmaking range expanded or something like that when the queue timer hits a certain point. Max said yes, this does sound like a good idea, it's just a matter of finding the time for the UI team to work on this kind of stuff, so probably not anytime soon, but he likes the idea. Someone asked about more ranked bans, and it sounds like they're open to it, but maybe are more leaning towards waiting until there's enough gods to just return to Smite 1's ban system where every player bans a god at once. Since the next ban expansion will be 6 gods, 3 per team, oftentimes the Smite 1 ban system only resulted in 6 to 8 bans anyway, as often the most obvious bans were overlapped on both teams, resulting in effectively only 6 to 8 total bans, so they might just go back to that system rather than expanding to 6 bans. A ban vote was also mentioned where players vote who to ban, like for example in Marvel Rivals, and the most voted are banned, but I'm not sure how well that would work as the roster grows in size. When we have 150 gods or whatever, it might result in everyone voting for different gods and nothing getting banned. I'm not really sure how that one would work. Someone asked about a punitive queue to put toxic players in with other toxic players, and they basically said the player base is low enough to where that queue would basically be a suspension anyway. They'd be very unlikely to find games in any reasonable amount of time, and you may as well just suspend them at that point. If anything, that's probably better as it gives them time to think about their actions without completely ruining their in-game experience via a toxic queue. But that's everything discussed on the Matchmaking Titan talk that happened on Friday. A very interesting talk in my opinion. It was basically all matchmaking discussions. There weren't really any general game questions and stuff like that, but we'll probably have more of that coming on Monday, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to catch my future Titan talk recaps. But this one was really interesting to me. I know a lot of players have a ton of questions about matchmaking and stuff, so I thought I would cover this one in detail. Probably a bit longer of a video than normal, but I thought it was worth doing. Catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.